Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Balint.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to take a moment to acknowledge something that I fear might be getting lost in today's conversation, which is that asylum is a human right and it's protected by law in the United States. And so I sit here today as a newly elected member of Congress. My grandfather, Leopold Balint, was killed by Nazis during the Holocaust. My father and his family sought safety and security and a chance for a better life. And I'm proud to be the child of an immigrant who was so grateful to this country that he served in the U.S. Army. I'm proud of him. I'm proud of our country for taking him in. And I know, and Vermonters know, that immigrants enrich our communities. We took to the streets in protest when the Trump administration tore children of refugees away from their parents. We welcome newcomers to our country and know that America must remain a safe haven for people seeking refuge and asylum. It's also true that well over half of farm workers in my home state of Vermont who live on farm are migrant workers. Migrant workers are an integral, critical part of Vermont's agricultural sector, and it's not unique to Vermont. Immigrant farm workers make up an estimated 73% of ag workers in the U.S. So immigrants and migrant farm workers literally put food on our tables across this country. And because these issues are also about the economy, immigration policy is complex, and it can't be just about enforcement policy alone, and which is why President Biden understands this and understands that migration from South and Central America also follows deep-rooted political and social violence, environmental issues, environmental disasters, and economic instability. And he's addressing these issues head-on. In June, President Biden hosted the Summit of Americas to approach immigration with a comprehensive and collaborative framework. The result was the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection, an agreement between 21 countries in North, Central, and South America to promote stability and humane pathways for migration. So asylum is a human right. Immigration and migration are critical to our agricultural sector. We must remain a place of refuge. We must work to keep migrants and refugees safe. So my question to you, Chief Chavez, you've had a long career with Border Patrol. Chief Chavez, has there been a time when working well with your Mexican counterparts has helped keep migrants safe? And if so, could you please tell us about that time?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. So in my time in the Border Patrol, I have had opportunities to work not only at the local level, sector level, but also here at headquarters on different types of programs like repatriation agreements, where we sit down and identify different steps along the process for repatriation, not only at the national level, but local repatriation agreements where migrants will not be returned to a foreign country during the nighttime hours. It'll only be during daytime under certain conditions or certain regulations. And I think that it's important that we, as an enforcement agency on the border between the ports of entry, that we're able to come to those agreements with foreign governments, because these are human beings that we treat each and every day, and that we ensure as an enforcement agency that when we do encounter these migrants, whether they're children that are unaccompanied, whether they're families, whether they're single adults, that we treat them with dignity and respect that they deserve, and that we keep them safe, that we keep them clean, that we keep them healthy, and that we give them an opportunity to bathe, because many of them haven't bathed for days or even weeks, depending on how long their journey has been. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Panama. I wanted to be there. I wanted to be and to see the Colombian and Panamanian border, because we had seen that and heard that there was a lot of different types of populations coming through there, coming through the Darien jungle up to the southern border of Mexico and then the United States. And to understand that journey and to be able to understand the complexity of the journey and the needs of these people. One of the things that we're very proud of in the Border Patrol is the ability to have those partnerships with Mexico right now and be able to understand that Not only do they manage the flow on their side of the border as it relates to migrants, but also with us on the northern border, on our side, because together we're able to have a more better understanding on how to better care for the migrants themselves.
Thank you, Chief. I hear you saying that we need dignity, we need compassion, we need to see them as human beings first. Thank you.
Yes.
I yield back.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Teacher, I know that education can be and should be a pathway to financial freedom. But for over 45 million Americans facing crippling student debt, education has become an unsustainable economic burden. Student debt is keeping Americans from buying homes, starting families, saving for their futures. It's holding back a generation from getting the education they need, that they want, that they deserve. This impacts all of us. Our education suffers because of this debt. Our economy suffers. Our families suffer. Our children suffer. President Biden's student debt relief plan will change lives and open doors for so many working families. It's urgent that the Supreme Court uphold this critical program that will free millions of Americans from this heavy financial burden. So today, I call on the Supreme Court to support President Biden's plan and make the historic step in making higher education attainable for everyone in this country. I yield back.
For 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. I rise today to urge my colleagues to vote against the previous question so that the House can address more serious matters like the future of seniors' hard-earned benefits. Bringing forth House Resolution 178 gives this body the opportunity to finally affirm our commitment to protect and strengthen Social Security and Medicare. This is what American families want us focused on. When I talk to Vermont families, they're concerned with putting food on the table, with keeping their families safe, with how they'll afford life-saving medications, not with propping up corporate polluters at the expense of our future. Americans need us on the record promising that families won't have to choose between essentials like medication, food, housing. Cutting Social Security and Medicare hurts the poorest and most vulnerable among us. These programs support seniors to age with dignity. They support Americans with disabilities to receive the security that they absolutely depend on. We're not going to let Social Security benefits go away. We're not. Over 65 million Americans rely on hard-earned Social Security benefits. 65 million. These programs are how we preserve the American middle class, and it's how we support all of the working families in each of our districts. We need to expand the infrastructure and funding of these programs to fully support seniors in their retirement. We owe them this. I want all Americans to know, Americans are not going to stop fighting to protect your hard-earned benefits. And again, I urge my colleagues to turn their attention to real issues that impact real American families and defeat the previous question. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Vermont, Ms. Balint.
The gentlewoman from Vermont is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in the strongest opposition to H.R. 734. This is one of the most powerful bodies in our nation. We should be using our influence and our power for good. We should be alleviating the suffering of our constituents and not fanning the flames of fear and enabling discrimination. You know, what upsets me the most about this bill is that it is devoid of compassion for the kids who just want to live their lives. I was honored yesterday to meet with Rebecca Balint. This wonderful 16-year-old girl spoke about the incredibly positive impact sports and community has in her young life. To Rebecca and trans kids everywhere, there are allies in Congress who care deeply about you, and we will continue to fight for your rights. We should not be choosing to use the power of this institution to attack young kids who just want to live their lives. I urge my colleagues to vote for the motion to recommit so that I can offer an amendment to protect student-athletes' sexual privacy and keep schools accountable when sexual abuse occurs. I ask unanimous consent to add the text of this amendment.
The
to
gentlelady
record.
is no longer recognized.
Committee, Ms. Balint.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 2811, the Default on America Act. A budget reflects our values, and we can plainly see where the Republicans' priorities lie. They're threatening default with catastrophic consequences. And why? Why? So they can secure 10 years of devastating cuts that American families depend on. Those programs will be devastated. Republicans have to abandon this dangerous path. America pays our bills. We must prevent default, as we have done countless times under Democratic and Republican presidents, including President Trump. A default will be a terrible blow to low-income and middle-income Americans. They don't care about these reckless political games. They care about how disastrous a default will be on them in their request to buy a house or lease a car or pay for college. They don't care about this. They care about results. I sit on the Budget Committee and have a front row seat to this nonsense.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
We have to pay our bills, and we have to reject the ransom note.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Vermont, Ms. Balint.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United States cannot become a deadbeat nation. We've never failed to pay our bills, and to do so now would have dire consequences on American families, including the ones living in my district in Vermont. As my colleagues have noted, we never had a hearing or a markup on H.R. 2811. We never got a budget. All we've got is this vague plan that was passed, and we have to try to make sense of that. So let's take a look at that. The Republican bill would potentially cut funding to low-income students at a time when we're talking about allowing people to get ahead. As a former teacher, I can tell you that cutting $4 billion for schools that serve 26 million low-income kids is going to lead to a cascade of negative impacts for those millions of kids and their families. The Republican bill would slash mental health supports for students. And at a time when we can all agree that we have a mental health crisis in this country, we should be investing more in this area and not making cuts. The Republican bill would also make college more expensive. A 22% budget cut would likely eliminate Pell Grants altogether. And it would reduce the maximum award by nearly $1,000 for the remaining recipients. So we should be making college, again, more affordable, not less affordable for regular families. And the list goes on in this vague plan that nobody will allow us to, put our finger on exactly what's going on in here. They left it intentionally vague. As a former teacher and as a parent, this is very alarming to me. Mr. Duda Gupta, can you highlight for us what the impact of the Republican cuts would be on America's public schools?
Thank you, Representative Balint. And I'll just start by noting, as you did, that we have a serious youth mental health crisis in this country. Nearly 1 in 6 youth ages 12 to 17 reported experiencing a major depressive episode in the past year. Among teen girls in 2021, the data show that nearly 1 in 3 seriously considered attempting suicide. And without adequate support for students and teachers, these statistics are only going to get worse. And unfortunately, we see cuts, as you mentioned, also to higher education, including Pell Grants, which are very well targeted, overwhelmingly to folks with lower and moderate incomes. Nearly 97% go to students in households with family incomes at or below $60,000 a year in 2020 and 2021. So that's well below the median income in the United States. And this will also hurt our public institutions, our public 2-year and 4-year colleges and institutions. But I will just sort of finally note that this is really undermining our nation's prosperity, because we know that these are investments. They are investments. Wherever you believe the money comes from, they absolutely do have a return on investment. So I really hope that folks can come together in Congress and understand that this non-defense discretionary category of spending has lots of critical funding.
Thank you so much. I am deeply concerned about all of our students. That's why I ran for office. That's why I serve. And again, I will stress about all of our students. I just want to mention some. Republican witness earlier noted a few federal programs that support LGBTQ people, including kids. And as a member of that community, it's really disappointing to me that my Republican colleagues seem to delight in attacking the LGBTQ people and their families and blaming us for all things, including now, it turns out, the deficit. So I just want to put this in perspective. Yesterday, I met for an hour with parents of trans kids from across this nation, and they came from all over, from conservative districts and states, just regular families. Parents came to share their experiences of what it's like in this moment. And you know what I heard over and over again? Why are members of our own government scapegoating us and our children? Why have we become the favorite enemy when we just want the same things that all American families want? We want to live safe, fulfilling lives, and we want to support and love and protect our children. It is morally bankrupt and deeply un-American to continue to attack these kids. It's time to do our job and pass a budget that supports and protects all of our kids, all of our constituents. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair recognizes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In many rural communities like Windham County, Vermont, where I live, pharmacies play a vital role in meeting community health care needs. Just like Dr. Duane, you said earlier, I mean, that resonated so much with me, all of what you said about the role that independent pharmacies play. It's really beyond dispensing medication. It's providing basic medical information services, providing counseling. And, you know, at one point I was between healthcare plans, and the paperwork wasn't done. And my independent pharmacist, whose name was Frank, I came in, and my asthma medication was hundreds of dollars a month. He came in, he said, you know, Becca, it hasn't come in, it's not running. He literally gave me the medication. He said, I know where you live. Come back when you have it straightened out. That is the kind of care that you get from independent pharmacy. So thank you for doing what you're doing for your community. Now, PBMs, as we all know, is what we've been talking about today. They contract with pharmacies to create these pharmacy networks, and whether or not patients use pharmacies in these networks can affect the amount that patients pay at the counter. And these arrangements can drive patients away from independent pharmacies in their communities. And in fact, I had a pharmacist tell me at one of my independent pharmacies, I can't really fill this for you, or I'm gonna take an incredible hit on my bottom line. And you've been a customer with us for years, and it's paining me to tell you you're gonna have to fill it somewhere else. So when I was the leader of the Senate in Vermont, we tackled the problem by enacting legislation that prohibits PBMs from reimbursing pharmacies in Vermont less than they would reimburse PBM affiliates for the same services, which I think is critically important. And Dr. Duane, I know Representative Frost was asking you some about this, but I'm wondering, now that we have a little bit more time, can you explain why it's so difficult for independent community pharmacies like yours to be part of these pharmacy networks? Just lay it all out for us.
So it's twofold. The first thing is that they can afford to offer themselves contracts that are poor, and then they can offer me the same contract. Yeah. They will happily, when they're vertically integrated, lose money out of one pocket to ensure that the money stays in the other pocket. So it's a lose-lose.
And you don't have another pocket.
No, ma'am, I don't.
Yeah.
So if I participate in that contract and it's a poor contract, I run out of business all the quicker, and they're happy. And if I don't participate in the contract and I close my doors to those patients, then those patients find themselves into an affiliated pharmacy, and they're able to keep that money.
Yeah, and this is the reason why we have lost over half of our independent pharmacies in Vermont, for this exact reason. And we know, and you talked about this, that each of the 3 largest PBMs also owns a specialty pharmacy that they use to dispense medications that treat rare or complex health problems. But these drugs do not legally have to be dispersed through a specialty pharmacy. And any licensed pharmacy can dispense a specialty drug as long as that drug can be purchased from a manufacturer or authorized wholesale distributor. So, Mr. Baker, how do PBMs use the specialty pharmacies that they own to incentivize patients to fill their prescriptions at the specialty pharmacy instead of Dr. Dwayne's independent pharmacy?
Yeah, I would say they don't necessarily incentivize anything, they mandate. It's, you
Thank you.
cannot go to his pharmacy, you have to come to mine.
Thank you for just like cutting right through that.
Yes,
Not an
ma'am.
incentive, just a mandate. So it is not hyperbole to say that independent pharmacies in so many of our rural communities are the heart of the community. That's where people get the medical attention and advice that they need, especially as rural America is losing so many of its healthcare providers. The pharmacy is critically important to communities like my own. And so it is really important that we understand the ways that PBM practices, maybe steering patients away from these pharmacies and making it impossible for these pharmacies to stay open. So it's a critical part of the ongoing work that I see that we have to do and that Democrats, I feel like, have been doing for years to try to make medication more affordable and accessible to all. I'm so glad that we're having this hearing. I really appreciate this, Mr. Chair. This is part of a problem that is making it incredibly difficult for rural Americans to stay healthy. It's as simple as that. Thank you. I yield back.
Very good. Chair now recognizes Ms. McLean from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here on this very important topic. I think what is encouraging is if you look around, we all agree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here today. Talk about these issues. They're very important to me. I come to this hearing as a teacher from Vermont who's worked in 4 different rural public schools and have really direct experience with dealing with rural poverty. And right now, 1 in 18 Americans live in what writer Matthew Desmond has called deep poverty, 1 in 18. He said it's so low, he refers to it as subterranean level of scarcity. And rates of poverty in this country have really not changed since the 1970s. And today, a minimum wage full-time worker cannot afford a 2-bedroom apartment anywhere in America, anywhere. So in all of our districts. And this obviously should trouble all of us, that people are working as hard as they possibly. Most folks are not better off right now. Dr. Mazur, as you know, for decades, the Republican Party has carried out essentially the same playbook of cutting taxes for the rich and then feigning concern over the deficit. We just went through this. It's really fresh in our minds, and then proposing spending cuts to vital programs such as Social Security and Medicare. And I know my colleagues are also teeing up part 2 of the Trump tax cuts when we haven't even been able to pay for the first phase. First phase cost us a whopping $1.9 trillion and has led to a proliferation of billionaires in the United States. And in 2018, for the first time ever in our country's history, the richest class of Americans paid a lower tax rate than working Americans, and the average effective tax rate of the top 0.1% of households dropped by 2.5 percentage points. Their greatest legislative achievement did nothing to address the unbelievable wealth inequality in this country. And according to April data from Forbes, the United States now has 735 billionaires, the highest number of billionaires in the world, who consistently use our tax code to the maximum advantage at the expense of American working families, like the Vermonters in my district. And just this week, we learned that one of these billionaires may be exerting influence over the Supreme Court. According to ProPublica, hedge fund billionaire Paul Singer spent some of his vast fortune to take Justice Samuel Alito on a luxury fishing trip. And he repeatedly had cases concerning his company in front of the Supreme Court. Now, I'm a daughter of an immigrant, and my parents, like so many others, sought to achieve the American dream here. However, the current American tax code has rendered the American dream basically unattainable for most people. Dr. Mazur, it's it's difficult for many of us to imagine it, but what would a more equitable tax structure look like today? What's possible?
So a couple of things are possible, I guess. One is that you could rebalance the tax code so that higher income people pay a larger share of their income for taxes. And that could be either through payroll taxes for Social Security or Medicare or through income taxes. You could look at the preferential rate on capital gains and dividends. There's a lower rate put on dividends that was supposed to account for the 35% corporate tax rate. It did not get changed when the corporate tax rate went to 21%. You could imagine changing that.
Can you unpack that a little bit more for people? Because I think it's really important.
Sure. So Congress passed a lower tax rate on dividend income back when the corporate tax rate was higher than it is today. And part of the reason was, stated reason, was that, well, corporations already pay a high rate of tax. You're being double taxed on this dividend as it comes through. But when the corporate tax rate was dropped, the preferential rate wasn't changed at all. So you kind of get a double benefit from that. So those are just a few things. One point that you made that I think deserves emphasis is looking at the minimum wage.
Yeah.
We have not increased the minimum wage in the United States in decades.
It's disgusting, is what it is. It's disgusting.
Yeah, and you're right that you can't afford to live on a minimum wage job.
No. You can work 40 hours a week in this country making minimum wage and not be able to afford housing, basic housing, not great housing, basic housing for your family. This should not be happening, and we should not be letting it happen. So I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I begin, I ask unanimous consent to request to enter into the record DHS data on U.S. immigration and customs enforcement.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Thank you for your public service. And I'm going to just shift gears a little bit here. As you know, Vermont has recently experienced the worst flooding in our state since the 1920s. Farms, houses, apartments, mobile homes, businesses, and shared community spaces have been devastated, including nearly every single small business in our downtown of our state capital, Montpelier. I've seen the destruction firsthand and can tell you the recovery is going to be long and hard. Related to this, a larger issue I'd like to highlight with my time today is the lack of options for small businesses that cannot take on additional debt to rebuild. SBA loans, of course, are a great help, but they are still loans, and we are a rural state made up primarily of small businesses. Of the 79,000 small businesses in our tiny state, 78% are independent contractors or non-employer businesses. So it is incredibly challenging for these small businesses to rebuild and take on more liabilities. But their presence in these communities is absolutely vital. We are a rural state made up of small cities and towns and villages, all in these little river valleys, which are essentially isolated from each other. And we need the ability to rebuild these small businesses. So I've heard directly from these folks that they're having a really hard time imagining how they will rebuild. FEMA has been incredible. They were on the ground just a few days after the emergency. I was able to tour with FEMA leadership as well as folks from Region 1. We are grateful for that help, but I want to make sure that over the long term, we are committed to working with FEMA and DHS to make sure that we find some long-term solutions for small businesses in particular to fill in this gap in the recovery. Along these lines, Mr. Secretary, what can Congress do to aid DHS and FEMA in continuing to react to natural disasters like this, like the flooding in Vermont, which was supposed to be a 100-year flood cycle, and it happened as recently as 12 years ago. So what can we do to partner with you to be more prepared for these?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. I look forward to partnering with you and other members of the committee to address the challenges that our nation faces. One critical need is, of course, funding for the disaster relief services and assistance that we provide, whether that is financial relief so that businesses and individuals alike can rebuild and recover. We also have critical grant programs that really contribute to the resilience of local communities. That is one very significant way in which we can partner together, and I very much look forward to working with you.
Thank you. And just to put a finer point on it, I was speaking with FEMA Administrator Criswell when she came up to Vermont. Is it accurate to say that FEMA's primary funding source, the Disaster Relief Fund, is going to go into the red as soon as August? Is that correct?
That is correct, Congresswoman.
Can you talk about the importance of DRF funding, especially as we prepare for another hurricane season and these increasingly intense storms that we are bound to see continually as the air warms?
The Disaster Relief Fund is the nucleus of our efforts to assist communities in recovering from natural disasters, which are only increasing in frequency and severity. That is the core fund through which we provide such needed relief for communities across this country, whether it's hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, flooding, the natural disasters that we are seeing more and more often.
Thank you. Just two more questions. Is there a role for the agency in mitigating future disasters? You know, we often move emergency supplementals after the fact. Is there value to more focused funding for pre-disaster work, and what would that look like?
Well, one of the takeaways that I had when I visited Mayfield, Kentucky, with Congressman Comer, following a devastating tornado, is assisting communities in revising their building codes so that they are ready for the weather that we encounter today and not the weather that we encountered 10 years ago. We really, as a nation, have to reform our infrastructure architecture to be ready for the extreme weather events that we are encountering today and will encounter tomorrow.
Thank you. I know I'm just about out of time. I just want to make the final point here is that I think it's going to be important for all of us long-term to think about how FEMA also can be a partner in dealing with the mental health consequences of these disasters, especially as they're happening more frequently. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Gentlelady yields back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start by saying these issues are difficult for most Americans to talk about. And I want to bring us back to the basic dignity and humanity of all Americans, full stop. Ms. Reynolds, I really appreciate you being here today. I too am a parent, and I know that I would do anything that I could to get my children the care that they need. And implied in what you've said is that that journey was not always easy for you. And I'm wondering if we could bring it back to the experience of real parents, real Americans right now who are trying to wrestle with these issues. Just tell us a little bit more, if you could, about your experience of trying desperately to get your child the support that you felt like they needed and deserved, and you didn't always know what that was.
So when my child came out as transgender, there was not sort of the hysteria that there is now about this. So there was not a lot of information. We didn't know anyone. We didn't know other parents. We didn't know other kids. So if you can imagine late nights on the internet trying to find any information, lots and lots of tears, lots and lots of discussions with my husband. What are we going to do? How are we going to support our child? And then we sort of put to the test the social transition, and then we spoke with experts, right? And we took our time and we learned and we grew. And as our child matured, you know, that sort of changed things too. It was painful. I don't want to, you know, I sort of don't want to focus on the negative of all of this, but it was extremely painful for us. It wasn't an easy choice. It wasn't anything that we took lightly. We took this extremely seriously. We were trying to get it right.
Yeah. And so is it fair to say that you tried to put the needs of your child at the center of all the decisions that you were making, difficult decisions in the face of a lot of stigma, a lot of misunderstanding, and you said recently the hysteria around this. And does the added stigma make it more difficult for parents in this situation to have the courage to stand up for their children? Like, what is that like when you feel like you are trying desperately to do the right thing, and you're hearing all of these voices that you are not being a good parent?
It's absolutely heartbreaking, actually. I've spent my entire career trying to help people, particularly children. That is what I do. And to sort of be looked at as a child abuser or, you know, an indoctrinator or something like that, it's extremely painful. It just adds a whole other layer to this. It feels very hateful and divisive.
I really appreciate you saying that, because I think there are a lot of parents across the country right now that are trying their level best to do right by their children. And this kind of heightened hysteria around this issue is making it very difficult for them to do that. So I wanted to bring this hearing back to basic humanity and dignity, because I feel like we have gone astray. That's the first thing I want to say. So thank you for being here. For Ms. Cole, I also want to thank you for being here. I'm very sorry you feel like you didn't get the care that you needed and deserved. Mr. Minter, you're welcome. Mr. Minter, if you could, talk to us about how gender-affirming care, what does that look like for young kids? What are we talking about when we talk about gender-affirming care for young children?
For young children, we're simply talking about parental love and support, not trying to change the child, recognizing that the child is transgender and allowing them to be who they are, and encouraging others, family members, to do the same. It's really just loving and supporting a child.
I really appreciate that. Again, let's bring it back to the basic humanity and dignity of all. The last thing I want to say is, in his opening statements, the chair said there's no such thing as gender assigned at birth. And I just want to be on the record here of standing up for the 5.6 million Americans who are intersex. And actually, that's exactly what the experience that they had was. They were having their gender assigned at birth, and they are Americans too. And they are trying to navigate this. There are atypical chromosome patterns, gonads, and genitals that do not fit typical binary notions of male and female. That does not make them less American or less legitimate or less worthy of dignity and respect. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair.
Speaker,
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I rise today in support of public schools. I am a parent. I'm a former middle school teacher. I'm also the child of a working class mom and an immigrant dad. And I understand so deeply that education is the bedrock of this great democracy. But Mr. Speaker, I am worried about our public schools. I'm worried about the news stories about banning books, erasing Black curriculum from schools. These Republican actions are not supportive of our public schools, or teachers, or parents, or our students. This assault on public education does not make us a stronger nation, a kinder nation, or a more thoughtful one. We don't have any fear about facing the complexity of our nation's history. Our democracy is stronger than that. It can withstand the ugly details, the inconvenient truths, and the uncomfortable nuance. We have a robust democracy. We have a republic that can face tough questions about its history. We need not be afraid of this. Age-appropriate curriculum about our nation's history must include the hard parts. Our students and our parents and our teachers can handle it. Let's trust them. It's concerning to me that in some districts, we have movements to prevent students from learning about slavery or the Trail of Tears, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Anne Frank. As the grandchild of an immigrant, a man who was killed in the Holocaust, child of an immigrant, grandchild of someone killed in the Holocaust. I know the importance of knowing history. I know the importance of speaking frankly and clearly about what happens when we don't know the details, when we simply demonize a group or dehumanize a group of people. What we need to do is shine the light of day on complex history. And when we use our time here in Congress to fan the flames of culture wars instead of investing in our schools, we are not doing the jobs that we were sent here to do and that parents want us to do. It doesn't matter what your political stripe is or whether you're not involved in politics at all. What you want for your children and your grandchildren is essentially the same. You want a strong education for your kids and grandkids. You want schools where all students feel safe and supported and can be their very best selves. We know that kids, they suffer when they don't have the resources that they need. We should be investing our time and energy into making sure all of our schools, regardless of zip code, have the resources they need for every single American kid to be successful. That's our job. It's at the core of who we are as Americans. It's not banning Judy Blume or trying to pretend that racism was part of our past and indeed, in many instances, is still a part of our present. We should not be afraid of these details. To ensure that the next generation of Americans are equipped for adulthood, we have to support well-rounded, holistic education that sets up our children for success. Now, I have a 13-year-old, almost 13, she'll be 13 in a couple weeks, and a 15-year-old. And I will tell you that every time we sit down to dinner at my house, we have robust conversations about the news. And in fact, my son, when I first started in Congress, I used to walk through the door on Friday afternoons and he'd say, "Mom, let's talk about your votes." And we have complex conversations about geopolitics. And I don't shy away from talking about the hard stuff with my son or my daughter. I trust them to ask the questions of me that are age appropriate. I wish that we could trust our families across this country more to be able to have rich and complex conversations with their students about curriculum that is often complicated. That is the human experience. That is the American experience. It is not tidy. Nor would we want it so. We are a nation of ideas. We wrestle with concepts. This is who we are at our best. We should not be afraid of this happening in our public schools. And I know the impact that quality education can have on our young people, and the danger that lies ahead if we use our positions as elected officials to be prescriptive about what should be discussed in our public schools. The continued attack on our public education, which is often fueled by divisive rhetoric and often, unfortunately, manufactured controversies, is an affront to parents and students everywhere. As I said, they know how to navigate complex issues. Why are we so afraid of this? Our continued dependency within this building of creating groups of people to demonize and dehumanize for political ends, unfortunately, then gets played out in public schools across this country. How is this possibly helping the democracy? I want students to ask hard questions. When I was a teacher, I welcomed them. I welcomed people from across the political spectrum and their parents to be able to come into my classroom and have deep conversations about difference. It's not about indoctrinating people. It's about having a place where we're not afraid to talk about hard things. Isn't that what we want for our schools and for our communities? I fear that we are so afraid of having hard conversations that we've stopped talking at all. Better to shut down any conversation about something that somebody perceives as controversial than to try to come together with differing opinions, wrestle with ideas, wrestle with complexities. This is who we are at our best. This is actually what this body was supposed to be, and what our public schools can be at their best, a microcosm of the democracy. And I know, having been a public school teacher, and I taught middle school, and people often say middle school is a great preparation for being in Congress for a whole lot of reasons, that public school teachers and the parents that support those teachers and those students are some of the most committed, compassionate members of our communities. They are invested in their students. They are committed to their communities. And unfortunately, they have become targets of baseless attacks that have come from divisive politics. And I have to say, the attack on public schools, the attack on teachers, it is not serving us as a nation. It is not, as I said, making us stronger. It is not making us more thoughtful. It is not making us more equipped to deal with the complicated world of geopolitics that we must confront. I welcome hard conversations, and I always have in my classroom. This is what teachers across this country are trying to do: hold space for hard conversations. Why are we so afraid of that? I also have to say, as a woman who has 2 kids, and my spouse is another woman, I want my kids to be able to go to a school where their teacher is not going to be reprimanded for acknowledging that my kids have a particular kind of family. I want my kids to feel like they have as much of a right to be in a classroom, to get an education, than anyone else. Why are we so afraid of difference? For many years in this country, difference, diversity of experience, diversity of background. We talked about our nation as a great melting pot. Sometimes it was called a fruit salad. Sometimes it was called a potpourri of experiences. It used to be that we celebrated that we did not see that as a danger to our very democracy. We are in what I feel like is not just uncharted territory, it is dangerous territory for the Republic. I know from representing Vermont, which is a rural state with hundreds of communities dotted across our wooded landscape, that the public schools are the heart and the soul of our communities. They are where young minds are nurtured, where curiosity is fueled, where community itself is fostered. And our teachers, in conjunction with the parents in those communities, play an invaluable role in shaping our children's future. They deserve to be acknowledged for the work that they do and not vilified. One of the things that I heard as I was campaigning across Vermont to represent my state in Congress, didn't matter what community I was in, people would come up to me at the end of events and say, I don't want to hate my neighbors. I don't want to feel like the only way forward is to be fearful of other Americans, people within my own community. I try to live my life here in Congress and as a former teacher as someone who is always thinking about how do we bring the community of man back together? How do we move away from a meanness of spirit that is not just corroding our work here, but is actually corroding our nation? Schools are an important part of people being able to come together and speak honestly about their experiences and their histories. It is a way forward for us as a nation. Why are we so afraid of having difficult conversations? Now, I never imagined that I would be standing here before you as the child of an immigrant and a working class mom, as a gay woman. I never thought that I would be walking in these halls. But I'm here, I have a place here, and I'm going to use my voice to continue to ask the question, what happened to our ability to have tough conversations without demonizing each other, without dehumanizing each other? We know what happens when norms are upended, when rights are attacked. We have seen this across the globe. We've seen it here in our own country. Public schools are an important part of building back the strength and the vibrancy of our democracy. At this time, I yield to my colleague from Michigan, Representative Tlaib.
Thank you so much for your incredible courage, my good colleague from Vermont. I know I come and grew up in the most beautiful, blackest city in the country, in the city of Detroit, where every corner is a reminder of the civil rights movement, a reminder of different movements that ensured that our black neighbors had human dignity. But now across the country, far-right extremists, elected officials like the governor of Florida are attempting to whitewash black history and ban books in our children's classrooms. Florida's own Board of Education just approved new black history standards, and public school students will be now taught that enslaved black folks benefited from slavery. The audacity. There's no two sides, Mr. Speaker, to slavery. Slavery was cruel, it was inhumane, it was a violent practice that denied our black neighbors and communities their basic human dignity. It had no redeeming qualities. Many of the founding fathers in this chamber even owned human beings themselves. These are just facts. These are our history. You cannot teach the truth about American history without teaching African American history. We must teach our children, Mr. Speaker, the truth about our nation's history. That means reckoning with racism, oppression, and lynching, dehumanization, and white supremacist violence. We cannot learn from our past if our past is no longer being taught. We will not allow anyone to rewrite our history. And again, it is so important that this chamber understands that black history is American history. And again, I cannot thank my good colleague from Vermont, Representative Balint, for really, truly championing this issue today. And again, from a community that taught me oppression against anyone needs to continue to be uplifted and fought against. I can't stand by, even if it's another state doing it, and say that it's okay and stand by idly. I can't stand by the sidelines, and we have to, again, continue to speak truth. With that, I yield back to my colleague.
Thank you, Representative Tlaib. Parents and voters across this country understand
the biggest challenges facing America's students in our public schools. And it's not about curriculum that includes details about slavery or the Trail of Tears or Anne Frank. That's not what most voters and parents care about. What they care about, number one, they care about getting students the support they need. And in some instances, that's one-on-one support to meet the needs of their students. They care deeply about addressing the educator shortages that we see across the country. They care deeply about ensuring that their students have the mental health services that they need. And they care deeply about the dangers of gun violence in their schools. They want candidates to address these issues. They want leaders who will address these issues. And I will say, the needs of parents are really not that different from the needs and the desires of students. I've spent quite a bit of time traveling across Vermont, speaking to predominantly middle school and high school students about what it is that they are concerned about. And they talk about the same kinds of things. They talk about needing mental health supports. They talk about how afraid they are to go to school because they're worried about the epidemic of gun violence. They're concerned that they won't be prepared for a future. They are not clamoring to have curriculum restricted. They want to have those hard conversations. In fact, you know, I taught middle school for many years, and I run into some of my former students who are now adults, and we talk about the conversations that we had in my classroom that were on hard issues, but they were age appropriate. I trusted them and their families to be engaged in the work that was happening in my classroom. I fear that where we're headed is a future in which what it is that teachers are allowed to discuss with students will be so restricted that our students will not be prepared for the future outside of their little communities. History is complicated. It is often ugly, sometimes really distasteful. I studied African American history and Native American history when I was earning my master's in history. I studied African American communities post-Reconstruction during an era known as racial uplift. I looked at Black women's community organizations and the work that they did post-Reconstruction to have vital supports within their communities. I studied Native American land claims. And the missteps and mistakes and atrocities that happened in history regarding tribal claims to land. I am a better person for knowing these things. It did not fundamentally make me a less patriotic American. It did not make me less grateful that my father came here as an immigrant to build a new life. Every nation has its complex histories, its difficult chapters, its reckonings. No nation is without dark spots in its past. But where we can rise above as a nation is to say, we will embrace head on the complexity and the nuance and trust our students and our parents and our teachers that they can have those conversations. And it will not make them less likely to love their country. But I will tell you, having taught middle school for a very long time and community college, that students feel betrayed when they are not given age-appropriate curriculum about the hard stuff. And then they find out about it later, and they feel like we have been withholding history from them, that we don't trust them enough to ask the good questions. I wish so sincerely that we would trust parents more across this country to be able to have a relationship with their local public school and their teachers, and together have those meaningful, sometimes difficult conversations. One of the things that I'm also quite concerned about is that we're not investing even in the infrastructure of schools. I'm concerned that there are so many aging buildings across this country that in a decade or two are not going to be structurally sound for our students. It's going to take a big investment of money to make sure that every single student has a safe building to learn inside. But our priorities often in this building are not around investing in the needs of our children and our families. And so I know that bill is going to come due. And there's going to be a time when parents and communities look back and say, why didn't we make those investments when we should have? Is it not true that our children are truly the most precious resource for the nation? Now, the other thing that I've been thinking about is that we, as parents, need to be willing to show up for our schools and our students, even when there is no controversy. Take an interest in what's happening, not because you have any kind of agenda, but just because you want to know what's happening in the schools. I can tell you that most of the schools that I know of in Vermont, they would welcome involvement from the community, whether it is a community garden, whether it is helping to lead after-school programs. What is the most frustrating thing is when people are not involved in the work of the school or what's happening there, and there's a sense of suspicion about what's happening there. And I can tell you, as somebody who volunteered as much as I could at my kids' school when they were little, I knew what was happening in the schools because I was there communicating. Public schools are not the enemy here. Teachers are not the enemy. Nor are trans people and queer people that seem to be on the receiving end right now of a lot of the vitriol around public schools. I went into teaching for one reason: alleviating suffering. That is the same reason why I ran for state senate. It's the same reason why I ran for Congress: alleviating suffering. in all of its forms. And when you're a teacher, you have to do that in real time, because kids come into the classroom with whatever they were dealing with that morning at home. And it's the job of the teacher to hold all students where they are and make the classroom environment a place where all feel safe and supported. It's not an easy job, I can tell you. Oftentimes, when you're a teacher, you get to the end of the day and you haven't remembered to eat or use the bathroom or take care of any of your personal needs, because there's only one thing that is important to you, which is making sure your students get what they need when they are with you that day. Can we please stop demonizing teachers? Can we please stop thinking there is some sinister agenda? People serve in that capacity because they want to make a positive difference in the lives of children. And sometimes it's as simple as sitting with a student who had a rough time on the bus in the morning, or someone who is carrying with them a deep insecurity about themselves, and that's getting in the way of their learning. We talk in education about differentiated learning. And we use that to talk about how students come in with different levels of success at a particular topic, particular curriculum, and you try to differentiate it, make it possible for them to be successful. But I've often thought when we talk about differentiated learning, we forget that that's what teachers do day in and day out with every single student they have. What does this student need right now? How can I help them get what they need so they can be successful? It is both exhausting and rewarding. Can we please stop attacking teachers? At this time, I yield to my colleague from Hawaii, Representative Takuda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am definitely out of breath. I ran here for my other hearing because this was just such an important hour that we participate in. Patsy Takimoto Mink is the mother of Title IX. She had a vision and a dream for her daughter and for all of our children to live a life free from the kind of discrimination she suffered as a woman of color. Her groundbreaking advocacy and reforms have since paved the way to allow all of our children to fully participate and engage in their education, in sports, and in all other forms of learning as their true, authentic selves. Removing discrimination and inequity on the basis of sex was personal for Congresswoman Mink. Throughout her pursuit of higher education, she faced racial discrimination, segregation, and limited opportunities simply because she was a woman. Many of us serving here in Congress on both sides of the aisle are here because of Patsy's perseverance and courage, and I am humbled to serve in the seat that she held with such grit and such grace. Like Patsy, I see every action or inaction we take here in Congress through the lens of a mother. While we cowardly delay action on gun legislation, I leave home each week terrified that one day an active shooter drill at my son's school might not be a drill at all. As we fight book bans and the perverse culture wars of the far right, I wonder, how will my boys feel when they see less and less of themselves in what is represented as history and in the books that are on the library shelves? While we watch as bullies in Congress try to push our loved ones back into the closet through guilt and shame, I hug my babies, now teenagers, every single chance I get, and I remind them, as I have since they were little, of my unconditional love for them and my only wish for them to be whomever they seek to be. As we fight in this chamber, kicking and screaming against what is nothing less than a movement to use our children as a means to institutionalize racism, legitimize discrimination, and oppress marginalized people and communities of color around our country, I often sit and ask myself, what would Patsy say? What would Patsy say? I cannot speak for this great tower of a woman, but I know in my heart that she would not stand for this kind of politicization of our children. She would stand shoulder to shoulder with all of us and say, hell no, not today, not today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Representative Takuda. Mr. Speaker, we have important work to do in this country. We need to continue to invest in schools so that we can reduce poverty. We need to alleviate hunger. We need to work together to build better outcomes for kids. We need to give teachers a living wage and create equitable systems that don't leave anyone behind. Your zip code should not determine whether you get a robust, rich education or not. Students, parents, educators deserve more. They need partners, not partisans. They don't need bullies. What they need is for us to stand up for robust, rich education and not be afraid to talk about the tough stuff. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Recognized for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Garland, thanks so much for being here today. I know it's been a long day for you. Now, I'm relatively new to the committee, and I'm still getting my feet under me, but as far as I can tell, what we are doing here today is talking about a lot of conspiracy theories, and it's frustrating and tedious for those of us in the committee, but I can tell you it is absolutely maddening for my constituents back home in Vermont. We have so much important work to do to keep the government open. We're days away from a shutdown, and I just want to remind folks that we're in this situation because my colleagues across the aisle are reneging on a deal that a majority of their conference made along with their speaker. That's why we are in this situation. If they are successful in shutting down the government, seniors who rely on Social Security benefits will be impacted. Thousands of Medicare recipients and applicants will be impacted. Service members will stop receiving paychecks. Veteran services will be curtailed. Those are the grim consequences from Republicans' inability and unwillingness to govern. I needed to start with that. Let's do some level setting here. Now, let's get to the real work of the DOJ and how Congress can help the agency better serve its mission. Gun violence continues to plague our nation. We see the wreckage every day on our television sets, on our computers, and in our communities. As a member of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, this issue is incredibly important to me and so many of my constituents. Now, I believe there's actual room for bipartisan congressional action on gun violence, at least in some areas. One of those areas, red flag laws. It's a great place to start. Vermont is one of 21 states that was able to pass red flag laws. These laws are working to keep guns out of the hands of people who are in crisis. And yet, many states did not even apply for funding from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act to better implement red flag laws and to raise awareness about the program. In June 2021, DOJ published model legislation to help states craft their own extreme risk protection order. Now, Republicans continue to make unfounded accusations that these laws violate civil rights by taking guns away from Americans without any due process. Can you explain the due process protections that are put into place in the model legislation that DOJ proposed?
Yes, and I would start by saying, of course, there's room for bipartisan agreement, and the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act is a very good example. And that includes the ability to have funding for states that want to craft and put into place red flag laws. The requirement is that the red flag law include due process protections. So I don't know every element of the model legislation, but the general idea is that relatives or friends of the person have to go to a court and get some kind of adjudication that the person is a danger to themselves or to others. This normally relates to mental illness problems. It may relate to some others. And so if a gun is taken away under those circumstances, there's then a right to appeal, to have a full hearing in order to adjudicate the question. That's I can't say I know every technicality, but I think that's about it.
No, I appreciate that. And it's especially important to states like mine, rural states that have real issues with the silent killers, domestic violence, and also suicide. And so these are instances in which red flag laws can really make a difference. Shifting gears here, I, along with Senator Warren and 20 of our colleagues, recently submitted a comment letter applauding the draft merger guidelines and urging agencies to finalize them. Corporate concentration remains a pressing problem for the U.S. economy, and I fear that we're falling behind in this area, and American consumers continue to feel the pain because of this. With the introduction of the draft merger guidelines, how does the department plan to ensure that future mergers and acquisitions do not stifle competition or harm consumers? Because that's often the pushback that we get.
Yeah, I think obviously the intention of the merger guidelines is to set forth the enforcement policy of the department. The different generations of the guidelines, which I hate to say it, go all the way back to the time when I was in law school, have been adopted and or been helpful to generations of judges. I've sat on at least 2 or 3 merger cases myself where we used some of the learning from the merger guidelines, and the current guidelines reflect really an adjustment to the current technology, two-sided platforms, network effects that simply did not exist at the time that the last set of merger guidelines were passed.
Thank you, Attorney General. Just briefly in closing, last year you spoke on the subject and said that DOJ's enforcement against corporate crime has waxed and waned, but it's waxing again. That is news to my ears. Thank you so much for your service. I yield back.
Lady.
Diversity and inclusion programs have been a mixed bag at best.
Dr. Nadal.
They're working on it.
Ms. Burdett.
The Emancipation Proclamation didn't work right away, but we had to work on it for hundreds of years. Don't give up.
I think we have a difference of opinion between students and adults, but thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be honest that many parts of this hearing have been extremely difficult to listen to. My grandfather, Leopold Balint, was murdered in the Holocaust, and my family has warned me my entire adult life that anti-Semitism is always lurking just below the surface. And we are seeing that today in stark relief in this nation, but also around the world. And so it's been personally difficult for me to sit through this, that here we are again. Here we are again. And I also had to pick my jaw off the floor when one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle bemoaned the use of dehumanizing language on college campuses, because I have not forgotten what was said in a fear-mongering hearing on the dangers of trans Americans, right here in this committee. It was a hearing full of dehumanizing language. It made me sick. And as the only member of the LGBTQ community on this committee, I've not forgotten. Now, it's been a long hearing, so I'm going to just cut to the chase here. In these situations, it's best to just follow the money. Not the rhetoric, not the messaging, not the talking points, just follow the money. So, there is a clear policy solution to combating the rise of anti-Semitism and other abhorrent discrimination on college campuses, and that is to fully fund the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. Budgets When you are in government, budgets are a statement of your values. How we spend money demonstrates what we really care about. And we should care about the rise in hateful speech and dehumanizing language in America generally, and specifically, as is the topic of this hearing, on college and university campuses. Fear-mongering and hateful speech isn't just destroying our communities, it's actually tearing this nation apart. And so we all have a part in that as well, all of us in Congress. So we can point fingers at college campuses, we can point fingers at what's happening in our elementary schools, but I would also say we have a part in that too, in putting an end to it. Now, it's my understanding that the Office of Civil Rights has already had a reported dramatic increase in Title VI discrimination claims in the wake of the terrorist attack on October 7th. Yet many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have proposed a significant funding cut to OCR. The Office of Civil Rights is one of the largest federal civil rights agencies in the country. It has over 500 staff who serve as attorneys, investigators, support staff. So it's been underfunded for years. And when it's underfunded, people who have cases, people who have claims, the staff's not there to do the investigation, to do the follow-up. So I would ask us to put our money where we say our values are. Now, a cut that has been proposed to the tune of reducing from $131 million to $105 million, that is a significant cut. It will have a detrimental impact on the ability of OCR to do its vital work. So again, I urge us all, follow the money. It seems like we are in a lot of agreement here on the things that are making us very uncomfortable. The antidote to speech we don't like is more speech. It's not shouting people down. It's not talking louder. It's not dehumanizing language. It is engaging in meaningful conversations when we have disagreements. It's that simple. So let's fund the office that is dedicated to making sure we're dealing with discrimination on college campuses. So I have 33 seconds. In that time, Ms. Burdett, can you just tell me what would be the ramifications if we were to cut from $131 million down to 105? Just really quickly, just give us a list of what's going to happen if that happens.
We know that when hate crime victims and students like these have no place to call, of course, that's a secondary victimization. It means the law enforcement can't respond to you. It means you have no recourse. Why would we take that away? If we are having a hearing, this isn't the PTA that has other tools. This is a House Judiciary Committee where I think we should look at what are the tools available. And we know where we have data about hate, and the Civil Rights, Office of Civil Rights does data collection on what's happening in schools. Data, government's not a university. We collect data because when we know what's happening, we can intervene. We can put resources there. And if we're not here to talk about how the federal government can make my boy safer, then we could be at a PTA meeting or at another kind of organization meeting. And so the budget is a moral document. And I'm even saying it's not enough to have investigators. Can we please invest in interrupting it before it happens? Not a single family of a victim of the Tree of Life shooting feels better that someone was punished. They'd rather have their brother back.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
The lady yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 5 minutes. We have 30 more minutes, if that's good. And like I said, if anyone needs a break, feel free to take a